There we go. Okay, let's open with prayer, and then we'll get into the text here. Lord, thank you for this time, this night, these people that have come. We enjoy meeting together. We enjoy being in fellowship. We enjoy reading your word that you've given us and praying to you. And we just pray that your presence is felt here tonight as we go through this, and that you show us how this is made applicable to our lives. So in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're in the 5th chapter of Judges, moving along so rapidly. Okay, that is my usual. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the 5th chapter. It's different. If you look at it, it's called the Song of Deborah. And it is a poem. It's also a song. It's actually a very ancient poem. We date it to around 1200 BC. It's when we think she wrote it. It's also set and has been set to music by the Jewish people over the years. And it's something that they may sing. And of course, it fits the pattern of, even though this one is written, of much of oral tradition that occurs culture after culture, where certain major events occur, and then they have a particular set of words often put to music. Native Americans have done this in oral tradition for thousands and thousands of years. Many, many cultures have done this. This one happens to be written, of course. It's actually, interestingly, somewhat like two other pieces, if you want to put it this way. And one of them, let me look here, is called the Book of the Wars of the Lord. Now, we don't have much about that. Wish we did. It's mentioned in Numbers 21:14. That's a reference to it. There's also, of course, another Jewish book that we also have very little of, if any. It's called the Book of Jasher. And it's found and noted in Joshua 10, verse 13. So, kind of in the tradition of these. Now, of course, this Song of Deborah, it summarizes certain truths about the history that we just studied in the 4th chapter of the book. And it's a victory hymn. And of course, as you'll see, it represents also some of Deborah's prophetic gifts. Because, you know, when we were going through the 4th chapter, there's some things that we looked at in the 5th chapter I took you to, because they were prophetically found there in the 5th chapter. And it makes them more clear as a result what was going on in the 4th chapter. Now, basically this Song of Deborah has 5 basic parts. The first verse is the heading, or the subject matter. The second is what we call, the second part, which is verses 2 through 11, is what we call the praise of Deborah, the praise by Deborah, actually, which occurs, like I said, in verses 2 through 11. The third part of this song or poem is verses 12 through 18, which is what we call the muster of the tribes. And you're going to see, as we saw last week, there were several tribes that responded to the call of Deborah and Barak. They contributed their military men to them, and of course defeated King Jabin's forces led by General Sisera. If you remember, that was the 4th chapter we talked about. The 4th part of it is the defeat of the Canaanites, and that's verses 19 through 30. And then the 5th part of it is actually verse 31, which is the concluding prayer of blessing and cursing. So, this is a very interesting document. We could spend a very considerable amount of time on it, but I'm going to try not to, so that we're not talking about it a year from now. It has quite an, if you study these things in Hebrew, it's very different. Because when you look at the Hebrew language and how it's written with Hebrew characters, you see some interesting things. So one of the things you see is it has a particular form in Hebrew. And we call this form A, B, A1, B1, A2. And it alternates in this form in the Hebrew back and forth over and over again. So it's all very systematically written. This is the way the Holy Spirit dictated it to Deborah. So you could study the internal structure of this thing for hours. It has word plays in it in the Hebrew. It has noun and verb combinations that start out one way and then turn on to oppose each other with the verb and then the noun opposing it. I mean, it has all kinds of very interesting elements to it.
Do you think it can be put on music?
I think it is put on music. I think people have put it. We don't know, of course, what it used to be in music, but yeah, but I didn't actually pull. I probably should have pulled a rendition by the rabbis of this song. It would be interesting to see how they put it, what kind of song they put. We could do that. Now, also, we see here that there's a connection in this poem, in this song, between God's leadership and His supernatural intervention here, tied back to God's leading and supernatural elements in the Exodus. Because it refers to the Exodus. It refers to Mount Sinai. So we see these elements in here. It implies or infers about the destruction of Pharaoh's army as a supernatural act by the Lord. And of course, we see the same thing in the 4th chapter, because what happens again and I'll try to go back to the map here for a second for you. Barak, of course, actually is from here, Kadesh, and he is called by Deborah to raise an army, and they start raising the army in Mount Hazor here. He initially raises 10,000 troops, but we see, and we're going to see here in verse in chapter 5, this Song of Deborah, that there's probably at least 40,000 ultimately that are raised. And they take from Zebulun, they take from Naphtali, and you'll see some other tribes that also contributed troops to this. Here is where the battle begins. That's where Sisera's army starts to march. Okay? They march northeast, and they march into a very famous valley. It's called the Valley of Megiddo, also called Armageddon, Har Megiddo. Okay? This is where they go. Now you'll see that there is a river that runs right through this. It's the Kishon River. All right? So they ford this, and there's going to be a battle here, and of course Barak has part of his troops coming out of Mount Tabor, and they're clashing right here. Now, of course, what happens, we know, and of course, what happens is that the Canaanites have had control, oppressive control over Israel, the Jews, for 20 years. We've seen that in the text in chapter 4. And of course, we know that they have 900 iron chariots, which is a formidable technology that the Jews, of course, did not at this point have. What we see that happens here, and it's referred to, we saw it in chapter 4, and it's referred to again here in the Song of Deborah, is that the angels of God, literally, okay, create a massive rainstorm. And the Kishon floods at a time that the Kishon normally would not in any way flood. And of course it makes for one muddy, mucky place. Therefore the wheels of the chariots and the chariots become impossible. They are no longer useful to Sisera. His army flees back down to the southwest this way, They just fall apart as a fighting force.
Kind of sounds familiar.
Yeah. But interestingly enough, Sisera himself, we saw last week, he goes up here to Kadesh. And the reason why he goes to Kadesh is because he has an alliance with this guy named Heber. And we went through and talked about Heber, and we mentioned that he is of a group called the Kenites. And the Kenites are not Jews, but early on in Israel's history, the Kenites, under Moses, actually traveled with Israel and helped Israel negotiate the terrain. And so they were a part, and they were given a promise. And we read that promise. I think it was in Exodus 14, I believe, that they would be blessed because of their association with Israel. Okay? So the interesting thing is that Heber has not made a specific coalition with Israel, but he has made a specific coalition with King Jabin and with Sisera's military army. Okay? So Sisera runs up here to Kadesh where Heber is. And if you remember last week, the first thing he does, which is of course absolutely well, it's a terrible move from the standpoint of all the traditions of the Middle East, okay? He goes to Heber's wife's tent. Not to Heber's tent, but to Heber's wife's tent, Yael, okay? And of course, as we went through it, Yael seems to agree to hide him, seems to agree to cover him with a rug, which she does. She seems to indicate that she'll honor this agreement that's been between Heber and the Kenites and Sisera's troops and the king, Jabin. And she seems to give all these illusions of help, gives him water. Actually, she gives him milk, actually asks for water. And of course, she covers him and then he falls asleep. And what happens then?
Puts an end to it all.
Yeah. She takes a tent stake, literally. She takes a tent stake and drives it through his temples, pinning his skull to the ground. Okay? Now, we're not going to go back through this like we did last week, because I had you analyze, from your standpoint, did she do the right thing or the wrong thing? Well, here in chapter 5, in this poem, Song of Deborah, it's very clearly stated that she did the right thing. So here's the second assassination that God authorizes in trying to deliver the Jews from their oppressors. Think about that. Ehud assassinates the king, remember? He makes a sword and goes while he's bringing tribute and assassinates him. And she also assassinates Sisera, too. Now, we also see here an allusion to, in chapter 5, the angel of the Lord. When we studied, remember back in our series we did on the spiritual realm, we went through all kinds of verses about who is the angel of the Lord. Where does he show up? He shows up many, many times in many, many places. He's obviously showing up in Exodus 14 by leading them by the cloud and by the fire at night. He shows up in killing the firstborn of the Egyptians. He shows up in the wilderness. He shows up when Moses sees the burning bush. He's there in the fire, literally, as we looked at those verses. And of course, he shows up here in chapter 5 also. So we see that this Song of Deborah is really also parallel to another song. And I want you to look at it real quickly just to show you. It's a parallel. Go from here in Judges 5 and turn back to Exodus.
Aaron's sister?
Go back to Exodus 15.
Miriam?
Yeah, it's not exactly that. It's actually Moses' song. Moses does a very similar thing in the 15th chapter of Exodus, where after the Pharaoh's army has been destroyed, he then is moved by the Holy Spirit to write this song they sing. It's also a poetic, just like the one we're studying tonight. And if you look at verses, especially at verses 8 through 12, to give you an example.
And was that first song of the nation?
Yes, it was. And it says, at the blast of thy nostrils the waters were piled up, the flowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide my spoil. This is Egyptians, of course, following after them. My desire shall be gratified against them. I will draw out my sword, my hand shall destroy them. This is what, of course, the Egyptians are saying in this. Verse 10, thou dost blow with thy wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like thee among, quote, the gods? And of course, we talked about that. The word there is Elohim, the gods. We could call them the demigods, okay? O Lord, who is like thee, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders. Thou didst stretch out thy right hand, and the earth swallowed them. So it's a praise to the supernatural activity of God in that. And of course, it's the same thing. There's supernatural activity by God here in chapter 4 and chapter 5 in Judges. So what I like to do is go through the verses with you and kind of summarize them. So let's go back to Judges chapter 5. And let's take verses 1 through 3 first. I'm sorry, 1 through 5. So, it says, then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day, sang that the leaders led in Israel, that the people volunteered. Bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O rulers. To the Lord, I will sing. I will sing praise to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when thou didst go out from Seir, that is another reference to Sinai, another word for it. When thou didst march from the field of Edom, the earth quaked, the heavens also dripped, even the clouds drip water. He's talking about what happened at Mount Sinai, okay? The mountains quaked in the presence of the Lord, this Sinai at the presence of the Lord, the God of Israel. So he says what happened, the miraculous nature of Sinai is also, in its own way, the miraculous nature of what happened in this battle where Sisera's troops were routed. So he makes reference here to the fact that they were open to and motivated, and many of the tribes, to act and to lead, and both to the leaders of Israel and also to the common person. So it talks about also, as we said, the parallels between Sinai and what on there and what goes on here. Now, let's read verses 6 through 8 in Judges 5. In the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, you remember who Shamgar was? Who was Shamgar? You remember? He also was a judge. He has exactly one verse dedicated to him. Okay? He takes he takes the gardening tool that they use to take mud and stuff. Oh, that long, I forget the name right now. We went over. Remember, I showed you pictures of it.
Yeah.
And he uses it to kill hundreds and hundreds of the people there, the bad guys on the west coast and the Med there. So in verses 6 through 8, so in the days of Shamgar, in the days of Yael, of course, who we just saw in the previous chapter, this woman Yael, the highways were deserted, and travelers went by roundabout ways. The peasantry ceased. They ceased in Israel, until I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel. New gods were chosen. Then war was in the gates. Not a shield or a spear was seen. Now remember that statement. Not a shield or a spear was seen among the 40,000 in Israel, the 40,000 troops that are going to be used in this battle. She goes on and says the volunteers, they were the volunteers among the people. Now, in other words, under Canaanite rule for 20 years, okay, they were literally a militarily occupied country. The highways were deserted. Okay? People went through back routes. Why?
Because of the oppression.
Right. Because you didn't want to expose yourself to the military elements that could decide arbitrarily to kill you or rob you or do whatever they wanted to do to you. So it was a dangerous time, that 20 years, for the Jews to live. They were they had an occupation force. Additionally, as we saw in verse 8, they had no weapons that they personally owned. And of course, as a result of all this occupation, they were poor and oppressed. Now, I want to point this out to you again. Hold your place in Judges 5, but go forward to 1 Samuel 13. I want you to see a reference again. We've pointed it out before, but I want you to see it. 1 Samuel 13, and we're going to read verses 19, 20, 21. Now this is the condition of being occupied by the Canaanite peoples, okay? Verse 19, now no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel. And you think to yourself, well, why would there not be a blacksmith? Well, you're going to see real quickly why not, okay? For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears, right? Therefore, verse 20, so all of Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. In verse 21, it even tells us what it cost to do that. And the charge was two-thirds of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, the axes, and to fix the hoes. So in other words, what's it saying? Summarize it.
They didn't want Jews to have any weapons.
Right, they were disarmed.
Therefore, one of the policies of the people was you had to go to an authorized Philistine blacksmith. He would only sharpen those things that were legitimately used in agriculture, your tools, so that there weren't any Jewish blacksmiths that could make any weapons, right? This is the condition of an occupied country. Now, I want to diverge for a moment at this point, and I want to talk about this issue of being an occupied country. I'm going to talk about a writing here. It's by Joseph Martino, and it's a very interesting sociological and historical work called Resistance to Tyranny. Now, I want to tell you first, I'm going to go through this and show some data to you. This is not a political discussion. I'm not trying to make it a Republican or Democratic issue by going through this, but rather it's the recounting of patterns in history. And that's what I want to show you. The history tends to repeat itself in very specific ways over and over and over again. Now, when you pass this out, I want you to have this chart. Now, this chart was put together by Dr. Rudolf Rummel, who is a professor of political science and department at the University of Hawaii. And what he did is he took and showed a comparison of all the military casualties from the year 1900 to 1990, almost 100 years. And then he contrasted that with those people killed by governments. And what you will see when you look at that document is that the total number of individuals that were killed by government entities was 119.4 million. Okay? What you'll also see is the number that were killed in international warfares or civil wars for that 90 years was 35.7 million. Therefore, almost 3.5 times more individuals, citizens, were killed by governments than were killed by all the wars of all that put together between 1900 and 1990. I hope that shocks you, because I think most people would conclude that it's World War I or World War II or Korea or Vietnam that would kill most of the people, but it's not. So let me break this down for you.
Well, you got 2 countries you got there to start.
Oh, there's a number of them we're going to
There's
pick.
a whole slew of them. But 2 big ones.
Yeah, there's 2 big ones. So let me show you.
Actually, more than 2 big ones.
Let me start early on in the 20th century. We're going to talk about the Turkish massacre of the Armenians. Many people are not familiar with the Turkish massacre of the Armenians. It's kind of been lost in history, but it was really a horrific genocide. So what happened is this. The Turks, in 1911, the Turks passed laws that banned ownership of any private weapons. It banned the ownership of them, guns. It banned the sale of them. It banned the manufacture of guns. They banned powder or any explosive material. So they had laws in Turkey against it. No one could own these things. These laws started in 1911. In 1915 through 1917, in that 2 or 2.5 year period, the Turks systematically killed 1.15 million Armenians in 2 years' time. Why?
Ethnic cleansing.
Armenians
It was.
were Christians?
Yes, Armenians were predominantly Christians.
It was ethnic cleansing.
It was ethnic cleansing, absolutely. Okay? The Turks had systematically disarmed and confiscated all weapons between 1911 and 1915. Therefore, and they were actually literally counted and cataloged, and they have them as records. You can actually find historical records of them doing this. Those found not turning in weapons were arrested for, quote, conspiracy against the Turkish government, which is a very interesting way for a government to define those people that oppose it being tyrannical and authoritarian. Okay? But think about it. In a 2.5 year period, after confiscating all weapons, they systematically murdered 1.15 million Armenians. Okay? So let's go to the second example, which is a bigger example, and probably the one that Norman was talking about. Let's talk about the Soviet Union.
That was one of them.
The Bolsheviks imposed gun controls in 1918. Now remember, the October Revolution was October of 1917. Okay? In 1918, they imposed gun laws. By August of 1918, the laws were issued requiring registration of all firearms, registration of all ammunition, and registration of sabers. Those were the things that were in those laws. By October of 1918, you had to also get a registration certificate, but later on that year, all of them were universally revoked, and therefore private ownership was banned in the post-revolution Russia. By 1922, there were a series of laws that were universal gun control laws, and they were put into the Bolshevik or the Soviet criminal code system, punishable by years of hard labor. Okay? In 1929, confiscation of all private weapons in Russia was complete. And starting that year, Stalin started doing a systematic purges of peoples in Russia. They were genocidal campaigns against elements of the Russian people. It is estimated that 50 million Russians were killed over years of time by these persecutions. 50 million. Now, I want to read you a quote, and I think it's extremely well put. It's extremely tragic, but it's a quote by a very famous person that I've quoted before, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn, of course, lived during part of that period. Here's what Solzhenitsyn says, quote, "How we burned in the prison camps, later thinking, what would things have been like if every police operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return home alive. If during periods of mass arrests, people had not simply sat there in their apartments, being terrorized by hearing banging downstairs at the door and hearing all the steps coming up the hallway, but rather if they had understood that they had nothing to lose, and if they had boldly set up in the downstairs hall an ambush of a half a dozen people with axes, hammers, pokers, or whatever else was at hand, the officers would very quickly have suffered a severe shortage of their number. And notwithstanding all of it, Stalin's thirst, the accursed communist government machine would have ground to a halt. But no one resisted, because no one had arms to resist. They'd all been taken away, and 50 million people died as a result of that. Is that a fair? Okay. My wife, obviously, having grown up under the Soviet system herself, knows this history.
Was there certain nationality or ethnic group or just
There was
anybody?
anyone that was considered a political opponent.
Oh, yeah.
And you didn't have to have
Yeah.
to be put in jail.
It really, in a lot of ways, it's the same way today.
Well, we're getting there. We're getting there. Okay. Now let's go to Germany. The Weimar Republic, post World War I, in 1919, confiscated all weapons in Germany.
That was the Kaiser that made it.
Yes, that was true. In 1928, the ban was relaxed and permits were issued for private ownership of guns in Germany. But once Hitler came to power in 1936, he enacted the Nazi gun laws banning private ownership of guns except for several groups. He allowed them obviously for the military. He allowed ownership for the SA, also called the Stormtroopers. He allowed them for the SS. He allowed them for what's called the black shirts, and he also allowed them for the brown shirt members. All of these groups were allowed to have weapons, and they terrorized and killed any people that were considered in opposition to the Nazi government. Okay?
You need to back up to 1933.
Okay?
He really came to power in beginning of 31, and then in 33. And the difference was when he became chancellor.
Yes.
That made a difference.
That was 36.
And that was 36.
Yeah.
But he had taken control before that.
Yes. Yeah. He had influence for a number of years and formally was elected. Remember, he was elected by the German people as Chancellor of the Weimar Republic.
He
Voted.
ran one heck of a
Oh, he ran one heck of a disinformation campaign, didn't he? The Nazis were certainly excellent at disinformation. So
he kept his promises.
Yeah.
When you look at what he did, because what appealed to everybody, they were out of work. They didn't have food.
True. They had a terrible economy.
And the stupidity to allow him to come together was done by France, it was done by Britain,
It was.
the United States, because they made them pay for World War I.
They did.
So the mark went down to less than a penny.
Yeah, they were severely penalized economically
That's right.
because of World War I.
And if it wasn't for that, Hitler wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. Once World War II broke out, we found that there were areas of organized resistance against the Nazis. For instance, the Maquis was a group in France that were they tried to oppose him. The Chetniks in Yugoslavia tried to oppose him. The Home Army in Poland tried to oppose him. The ELAS in Greece tried to oppose him. But in every single case, they suffered from a terrible lack of weapons. Okay? I want to read you an example of this about the terrible lack of weapons. It's a quote. This is a British officer who is observing one of the Maquis units in France. He says, the 30 men in the camp were disciplined, well-fed, and happy, divided into groups of 5 each and commanded by an officer. All the armament they possessed between them consisted of one long gun with 100 rounds, 3 French rifles with 5 rounds each, and 10 revolvers with 10 rounds in each. There were no grenades or anything else to be had. The available arms were used by all in turn for instructional purposes, for drilling, for weapon stripping, and fieldcraft exercises at night. The lack of ammunition prevented them from ever having target practice. Now, these were the groups that tried to oppose Hitler. But the problem is they had no weapons to oppose him. And therefore, we know that conservatively, between approximately 1936 and 1945, there were well over 15 million people killed by the Nazis. Okay? Some people say that you have to add another 12 million into that, which was the systematic eradication program against the Jews. And of course, he also systematically eradicated another 6 million he considered to be the defectives. They were not Aryan enough, or they were truly mentally defective, etc. So, lots of people died. This does not even take into account the number of people that were killed by the Nazi troops on the battlefield, too. Okay? Now.
You missed one group.
Okay?
Homosexuals.
It's true. He killed them, too, systematically. That is true. Okay. Next. China. At the communist takeover of China in 1949, they imposed gun control and gun laws. They further had restrictive gun laws also issued in 1957 and prohibited all ownership or purchase, manufacture of all weapons and ammunition. During the 1960s, a group that Mao used as political weapon against any of his, quote, opponents was called the Red Guard. The Red Guard started genocide campaigns against those individuals that were considered to not be adequately communist. Okay? It is estimated during the 1960s that the total death toll by the Red Guard was 80 million Chinese. 80 million Chinese.
Makes the Japanese look like nobody.
I know. Now, next one. Uganda. In 1955, the British, who controlled Uganda at that point, passed gun control laws. In 1970, Rwanda developed its own independence from Britain. And I'm sorry, did I say Uganda? It's Uganda. In Uganda, after that independence, also that government passed further gun control and licensure laws. In 1971, a person came to power, Idi Amin. He seized power in 1971. He first purged the army, and then he attacked civilians who were to be suspected non-loyalists, killing over 300,000 individuals in a country of 13 million. They were very vicious, genocidal campaigns. Cambodia. In the communist country of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge won the Civil War. They won in 1975 after 5 years of conflicts. Previously, in 1938, the previous Cambodian government had set up gun control laws against private ownership of weapons. In 1975, when the Khmer Rouge became the controlling force in Cambodia, they went village to village collecting any privately owned weapons of any sort. They then would take whole villages, take them out in fields, and systematically murder them. It is estimated that in 4 years' time, the Khmer Rouge killed 1/3 of the population of Cambodia.
It's called the Killing Field.
The Killing Fields, and there's movies about this. It was brutal,
And movie.
yes, systematic genocide. Now, I could go on. I could go on now, but I'm not going to go on. But I am going to do one thing. I want to read a couple quotes to you, okay, that I think are relevant. And I think they're particularly relevant in terms of what's going on in this country at this time. Here's Thomas Jefferson. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves from the tyranny of the government. Remember, those that are talking about gun control never want to talk about the real purpose of it in the Second Amendment. Rather, they want to talk about other issues like, well, really they allowed guns for hunting. That was not the purpose of why the Second Amendment came about. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, who was a strong supporter of central government, said the following: if the representatives of the people betray their constituents, then there's no resource left but in the exertion of that original right of self-defense, which is paramount to all positive forms of government. Thomas Jefferson said the following too: the Constitution of most of our states and of the United States asserts that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed, and that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press. George Washington has the following quote: firearms stand next to the Constitution itself. They are the American people's liberty teeth and keystone of independence. To ensure peace, security, and happiness, the rifle and the pistol are equally indispensable. The very atmosphere of firearms everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that is good. He's talking about weapons. And finally, I'll quote Jefferson again. He says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here's the next line: that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In other words, governments are established by the people, not people by the governments. Governments are not to run people's lives for them, but are instead to protect the people in a peaceful manner so that they may conduct their own lives. Okay? I could go on and on and on and on by quotes of more and more founding fathers, But in every case, you find that there is no understanding of the Constitution of the United States that didn't include the Second Amendment. David, do you have any words on that?
I think it's been perverted into what we're seeing today with the efforts of gun control right here.
Okay.
If I may comment,
Yes, go ahead.
when we're dealing with what we're talking about here, and you're making reference to, there is always a fear element that starts the issue. And what happens today is that fear element is broadcast instantaneously. And so
Yes.
we're not just seeing the reasons for wanting gun control. We're seeing the spread of fear in social media that then dictates in the minds of people that we need to take guns away from people because guns are what's causing the problem. A gun has never killed anybody. By itself, it's just like a spoon or a fork.
Yeah, they're using guns to get rid of guns.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Perfect statement.
I'm making a summary statement to the information I just went over, and here's what my summary statement is. See if it makes sense to you. Human nature doesn't change as a group. In other words, you have change in human nature by individuals, for instance, that accept Christ and are changed. But human nature does not change in general as a group. Okay? The need for power, money, and control is constantly among the elitists and is a perpetual threat against all citizens of all countries, and only force can ultimately deter its worst plans. Okay? Consider that, if you will, because I think that the evidence historically and the evidence sociologically is that that is exactly the case. So, again, I'm not making really a political statement. I'm making a historical statement, and we're talking about very clear trends. So that if, like Norman said, if the argument is made by individuals, we're safe when we get rid of all guns in the United States, the Founding Fathers said exactly the opposite, and the evidence of history is clear. Okay? Gun confiscation occurs prior to genocide. Always.
One of the things that you have to look at if you're going back in history, if you go back into the 20s, there was one reason a man owned a rifle back then, if he could afford to own a rifle during the Depression. And what was that? Anybody remember? Put food on the table.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That was the whole purpose. Now, if you look at that time frame, when Roosevelt was president, he couldn't get a Republican Congress to allow him to build an armada, build planes, build aircraft carriers, and assist the Brits in the fighting of France. What he had to do was do what? Does anybody remember? There was a program that he put forward on his own, signed an executive order. Congress had a fit. Remember what it was?
No, I don't.
Lend-Lease.
Oh, the Lend-Lease.
He leased the weapons.
Okay.
He went around legally. You got two scholars here, two attorneys, and he went around the philosophy of Congress. We're seeing that today.
Yes, it's true.
You're seeing that very much
Right.
today.
Right.
And if he hadn't done it, Britain would have fallen.
That's true. They would have been German, probably, as a result of that. So, there's only really one thing worse, in a sense, in a society than the attainment of weapons, and that is having none. Okay, because it is, as the Founding Fathers said, the absolute foundation stone of freedom. Okay, their point was, very bluntly, We want you to be free to have weapons, so the government we set up becomes tyrannical. You can get rid of it. That's what they were saying. Okay? Some people think we're about there, actually, at this point. Let's go on to chapter 5. I'm going to try to finish this tonight.
Okay, we're going back to Judges, right?
We're going back to Judges. So let's read verses 9 through 11. My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, the volunteers among the people. Bless the Lord. You who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who travel on the roads, sing. At the sound of those who divide flocks among the watering places, there they shall recount the righteous deeds of the Lord. Basically what Deborah is saying in this is that she praises God that the people volunteered at the time of need. Both the rich people, that is, those who rode on white donkeys, and the poor, those who walked along the side of the road, all parts of Jewish society were willing to contribute to this military endeavor. And of course, they heard the great and saw the great story of the Lord's deliverance of them. Now, let's read and cover 12 through 18. Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake, sing a song. Arise, Barak, and take away your captives. Then survivors came down to the nobles, and the people of the Lord came down to me as warriors. From Ephraim, those whose root is in Amalek came down, following you. Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, commanders came down, and from Zebulun, those who wield the staff of office. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. As with Issachar, so was Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels, among the divisions of Reuben. There were great resolve of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds, to hear the piping of the flocks among the divisions of Reuben? There were great searchings of heart. Gilead remained across the Jordan, and why did Dan stay in his ships? And Asher sat at the seashore and remained by its landings. Zebulun was a people who despised their lives even to death, and Naphtali also on the high places of the field. Now what Deborah's talking about here is what tribes contributed to this military battle and what tribes didn't contribute to it. So basically what she's saying is that even though all of them were called, there's a blessing announced on especially Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, and Issachar, those tribes, because they all contributed to the military effort. There's also a taunt in there against Reuben, against Gad, and against part of Manasseh, which is referred to by the term Gilead. Also, there is a statement of dishonor aimed at Asher and Dan. So it ends up being a great tribute to especially the tribe of Zebulun and Naphtali as they're praised for their courage in this battle. All right, 19 through 23. The kings came and fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan. At Tanakh, near the water of Megiddo, they took no plunder in silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera, and the torrent of the Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. O my soul, march on with strength. Then the horses' hooves beat from the dashing of his valiant steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, utterly curse its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, against the warriors. So let me summarize this for you, okay? Of course, the Canaanites were led by their general Sisera. And they fought well, it's not on now, but they fought in Megiddo near this town called Tanakh. That's the reference to Tanakh. It's about 5 miles southwest of Megiddo. Now, of course, it's in the valley of Jezreel. It states, interestingly enough, in verse 20, of the supernatural nature of what happened. Literally, the angels of the Lord, called the stars, okay, caused this huge unseasonable rain, causing the Kishon River to flood, and of course then mired down Sisera's 900 chariots so that they ended up being useless. The reference to Meroz as being a cursed town is because it's located near Sisera's army in their flight back down to the southwest. Meroz and its people, a Jewish town, did not help against the fleeing army of Sisera. They simply stood by and didn't help the Jews and annihilate the army. So there's a curse against Meroz that's mentioned here. Notice also the reference here again to the angel of the Lord. Okay, do you see it? Verse 23, curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Now, this must have been a fairly significant curse against them because remember the last time that the angel of the Lord acted was, of course, we go back to Egypt again and the killing of the firstborn of the Egyptians. So who knows exactly what happened to Meroz, but it wouldn't be hard to imagine that it didn't exist anymore after that. Now, verses 24 through 27. Most blessed of women is Yael. You remember who she is, right? Okay. Remember, she's not a Jew. She's a Kenite. Okay? She's a Gentile. Most blessed of women is Yael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed is she of the women in the tent. He, the reference here is to General Sisera, he asked for water and she gave him milk. In a magnificent bowl, she brought him curds. Maybe yogurt would be another way to put it.
Nice way to put it.
It is a nice way to put it. She reached out her hand for the tent peg and her right hand for the workman's hammer. Then she struck Sisera. She smashed his head. And she shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet, he bowed, he fell. He lay between her feet. He bowed, he fell. Where he bowed, there he fell dead. Okay?
She wasn't very nice.
Well, she wasn't, but of course she was doing the will of God in the situation. So her courage is recognized. And of course, she identified the correct enemy. It was not Sisera. It was not the Jews, but rather it was Sisera and his army was the correct enemy. And of course, she was willing to assassinate him. And in this, she's praised for doing so. She's pictured after the assassination as standing over the defeated and dead general of the army. Okay? It's an interesting image, the woman standing over the dead general. Okay? Verses 28 through 30. Let's read it. This is an interesting kind of allusion here that's put in this poem, the Song of Deborah. Out of the window she looked and lamented, the mother of Sisera through the lattice. Why does his chariot delay in coming? Why do the hoofbeats of his chariots tarry? Her wise princesses would answer her. Indeed, she repeats her words to herself. Are they not finding? Are they not dividing the spoil? A maiden or two maidens for every warrior? To Sisera a spoil of dyed work, a spoil of dye work that is embroidered, dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of the spoiler. So here's this taunt, really, about Sisera's mother. He goes out to battle in his chariot, and she's saying, when's he coming back? I'm not hearing him return. He's supposed to be taking the spoil and the best goods that he finds and bringing it back here. Where is he? Okay, and it's this kind of allusion to this mother and imagining how she was feeling when he didn't return. Okay? Verse 31, last verse here. Thus, let all thine enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in the might. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years. So, this concludes with a curse against all of Israel's enemies and a blessing to all who love the Lord. This miraculous event, we see, gives peace to Israel for 40 years. But, what do you think is going to happen in the history of what we've read so far? And they did evil in the sight of the Lord. And of course, you don't have to go very far. Okay? You can go to chapter 6, verse 1. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them over into the hands of Midian for 7 years. And this we'll start next week with this. This is the cycle. You know, they cry out to the Lord for deliverance. He sends a judge to deliver them. They have 40 or 50 or 60, or in the case of Ehud, 80 years of peace. But what do? They fall back into worship of Baal. They fall back into idolatry. And God says, you want to live that way? Go ahead. And of course, another enemy takes over and conquers them. And they live under the bondage of the enemy for a period of time until finally they cry out to the Lord again, and God sends another judge. As we said, this goes on in the book of Judges for 350 years of time, and 12 judges during that time. So this is the cycle, but it's also the cycle of human nature. Okay? As we've said before, you know, how long is it that we seem to ever have a vibrant church? Not more than a couple generations. You know? And then it changes.
Because the soul of man is inherently evil.
It is.
Period.
It is.
Black or
Exactly.
white, it's just the way it is.
Yeah. I think many of us will look at the condition of the church today in America and we bemoan it because we see that it appears to be terribly weak, terribly poor in Bible teaching, terribly awful in terms of their understanding of the Lord, of the words of the Lord, promises of God, etc., etc. And yet, it's predictable that it happens. Okay? People predictably end up, after having the blessing of God, eventually a generation later, 2 generations later, you end up, and this is why it's so hard, and we all, I think, have experienced this to a certain extent, why it's so hard to try to communicate the truth of Christ even to your own children. And maybe even more so to your grandchildren then. Because this is the cycle that occurs. And, you know, only in their own experience will they have the need, or sometimes the suffering, that will bring them back. Yeah.
I think one thing that's very important is the fact that we have Christian schools. And if you are interfacing with the kids in a Christian school, anything, and whether it's from the Catholic side, it doesn't make any difference. Their opinion is much more religious
Yes.
than the kids that have the
Nothing.
Columbus public schools.
Correct.
There's no comparison between them.
Yeah. There isn't. It's true. We still have, but compared to the public school system, it's still a relatively small number, which is, you know, they're reached it. Okay.
But there is a number.
There's a number. Okay. Now, let's close with prayer, and then we have to move on to the next things tonight. Michael, would you close us in prayer?
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the Word of God. We thank you that it truly is a light unto our path and to our feet. Help us, Lord, to follow the Word of God. Help us, Lord, in our individual lives as we live each day, that we put on Christ, that we are able to subdue the strength and the tendencies of our own flesh, Help us, Lord, to be studious of your word, to apply it, to ask you to help us apply it in our lives as we live each day. Help us, Lord, the remainder of the evening. We thank you for the lesson tonight. We pray, dear God, you would help us as Christians, as Americans, Father, that we would stand for the truth and stand for what's right. Guide and direct our lives individually. Be with each and every one of our families. Our loved ones, Lord, be with our members that aren't able to be here this evening. Watch over them in Jesus' name. We'll thank you for it all.
Amen.
Yeah.